My name is Karen Hansen and this is my store. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk today about what to quilt on your quilt. I have been a long arm quilter for long enough, and so I have some experience with my quilts and other people's quilts, and hopefully can give you some ideas about what to quilt on your quilt. The first thing I think you need to ask yourself if you're quilting for someone or for yourself is, what is the quilt for and how will it be used? Because so many people come in with a quilt and they really don't know the difference between custom quilting or edge-to-edge quilting or stitch-in-the-ditch quilting. They don't even know what they're asking, and it's helpful even for you if you think, really, what am I going to do with this? Am I going to wash it a lot? Is it a baby quilt? Do I really need to spend 27 hours quilting it? The other thing you want to look at is, what's the most important thing about the quilt? Now, if you're the quilt top maker, you may know that you spent a long time on one particular part, and you want to show that off with the quilting. You also may have a couple areas that you hope will quilt out, and, and you know that you need to maybe do a little more heavy quilting in those areas. Is there an area on the quilt that you want to highlight? Usually in any kind of artwork, and I'm going to call a quilt artwork sort of, there's areas that come forward when you look at it, and there's areas that recede when you look at it. Quilting can make that difference for you, and you need to kind of decide that as you look at it. What's the style of the quilt? Is it modern? Are you a sewist? Or is it traditional? The patterns that you choose to put on the quilt can also relate to the kind of fabrics that are used in the quilt, as well as the style of the piecing. I will say, yesterday someone was in, and the church ladies had long time ago brought in a set of very sweet embroidered flowers. You guys know the type, right? Pale pinks, light blue, on white. And she picked out a very modern pattern to set it with, and she's using some Aboriginal fabrics. I think it's going to be really great when it's done. I hope the other people in her church group don't give her a bad time. But the style of that quilting will probably be much more modern than a traditional Baptist fan, for example. Had she set it with pastel pinks and blues, it could have been a much different quilt and had much different quilting on it. Who's quilting it, and what is their/your skill set? So the first thing that anybody asks me is, what should I quilt on my quilt? You know, the obvious answer to that is, what can you quilt on your quilt if you're quilting it yourself? And one of the things I hope to talk about today is some simple things that you can do that maybe you don't know you can do that actually look pretty good. If you are paying somebody to quilt your quilt, I think it makes a big difference as to what decisions you make. When the quilter looks at you and says, well, what do you want me to do? And you say, well, I don't know. I say, well, black thread then. And we kind of go from, oh, no, that's not what I wanted. That helps get them going. But how much time do you want to invest in quilting the quilt is an important consideration, or how much money. So if you are making a quilt that's a gift for someone who really doesn't know much about quilting, you may not need to spend as much time quilting it yourself, or not as much money paying somebody to quilt it. We mostly use edge-to-edge pantographs on everything that's in here. We do very few custom quilts because we think we want the piecing to show, so we don't want to do anything fancy, and they're quilted. The other reason you want to use an edge-to-edge, if you've got busy fabrics in there. Look up here on most of them, unless you're in the right light, you can't really see the quilting. So if you've got really busy prints, you may not want to have it custom quilted. Now, does everybody know what I mean when I talk about custom versus the other? So I'm going to talk about the elements of quilting. An edge-to-edge, i.e., you can call it edge-to-edge quilting design, you can call it a pantograph design, You can call it a meander. Anything that covers the surface of the quilt, like this. Can everybody see the quilting on this orange and turquoise one? Anything that covers the whole surface of the quilt from one edge to the other without any consideration of the blocks or the borders is an overall edge-to-edge design. We lots of times use pantograph patterns. If you've never seen, whoops, if you've never seen a pantograph pattern, this is an example, okay? On a long arm machine, this is going to sit on the back of a table, and you can follow it with a laser light. They make lots and lots of pantograph patterns for short arm machines as well, or home machines. If any of you have a handy quilter frame, that's how I learned. One foot on the floor, one foot on the pedal, and following it it worked. It worked. But anyway, an overall design or edge to edge works great if it's a scrappy quilt, because you probably can't see the quilting anyway. There's lots of quilts that we've quilted that I'm not sure why we've taken the time to do a custom quilting job when you can't see much of the quilting anyway. It's on the bottom. Can you dig it out? Somebody made me custom quilt their quilt. I don't know why.
I know why.
Because you can't really see much of the quilting anyway, but this is a great example. Now, if it were her quilt and she was going to quilt it herself, she could have done it a custom job if she so desired, and no one would think twice about it. Because she made me do it, I'm still whining about it. May continue on for several more years. But, you know, I think the quilting looks good on it, but you can't even tell me what's quilted out here in this border. You can see that, okay, you got a little leaf, woohoo, big deal, in this border. But the rest of it is magnificently quilted, and you don't even know it. You just have to take my word for it. That's really, really good. It's really, really good. But you can't tell. Now, the other thing, and the most show-offy thing about this back, is that A, you can't really see the quilting, but B, it's pieced. And Smarty Pants over here did piece it, and you can't see the seam. But she's in treatment for that, and we're trying to we're trying to get around it. Okay, so you know, overall meanders, overall loops. When I first started quilting, for me, I got my quilts quilted, and they were done. And it's not a quilt till it's quilted, so all of these things are good things. But if it's not an overall, then it's custom. It's sort of like you have a pantograph or you have an overall thing, and anything else is custom. So when someone comes in and says, oh, I don't want much, I just want it stitched in the ditch, that's custom. Let's talk about what those kind of things mean. If you stitch your quilt in the ditch, and by stitching in the ditch, that means you're sewing along a seam line. It's an easy way to make decisions about a quilt, how it's quilted, because you don't have to really plan a design. You can stitch around the blocks, you can stitch around the borders. The problem with stitching in the ditch, if there's not a ditch, you can't stitch in it. What? Because if you are not a good presser, you did not press a ditch. And I know who you are. Because what happens is that when you stitch in the ditch, and this is really for the newbies, is when you stitch, you press your seam to one side. The ditch is the lower part, right? So you can feel along the seam, and you're going to sew on the lower part along the seam line. On a small machine, it's easier to stitch in the ditch than it is on a long arm machine, because it's steadier. You're on a platform. On the long arm, you have to use a ruler, and it's just harder. So when you ask your long arm quilter to stitch in the ditch, know that it's harder to do. If you're doing it and you're new, you're going to need to practice, and it's very time consuming. Background fillers are the simple designs that can be anything, and that's probably for me one of the hardest things. People say, what should I quilt on my quilt, right? So there's the basics of stitch in the ditch, and then there's block by block. Sometimes, let's just say a small custom job is maybe you have one border, so on the inside of the quilt you do an overall pattern. And I would just like to tell y'all that there's no shame in overall loops or an overall meander. If you can do it and that's what you can do, good. That goes back to what can you do. There's nothing wrong with that. And part of doing a good job is picking a simple theme and being consistent with it. So I used to say about desktop publishing in the 80s that you could make a lot of ugly real fast, right? Every font, every color, every size, woohoo! Okay, pick a couple motifs and stay with it. Pick something like an overall loop or, you know, a loop with a little swirl and be consistent with those things. But there's no shame in just putting an overall piece on the bulk of it and maybe a simple border. The other side of that, we're getting pickier now, are those blocks. To me, and I know this is what you're going to ask me about, block by block, what do you do? Right? The worst quilts that I hate to quilt, sampler quilts. They are so hard. I have to think so hard because every block is a little bit different, and if I've chosen a couple motifs up front, usually I'll say, okay, I'm using loops and swirls. That's it. If I'm staying with that, I can kind of come up with some designs for those sampler blocks to move through them, but everyone I sort of have to plan a new route. Okay, so far? Any questions so far?
What's a swirl?
Well, I'll show you.
Oh, okay.
So that's a great question. I have a marker board. I have another. That's a pen. No. And if I did,
I would get it.
you would. Okay. When I teach the beginning long arm class, I like to use, there's a book called Sally Terry's Pathways to Better Quilting. In case you haven't heard of it, those of you in the beginning class have seen this part. She says there's 5 basic shapes to quilting, and I think she's absolutely spot on. So there's a loop. Okay. There is a straight line. Okay, there's a hook. I like to think of it as cursive C's. Okay, there's an S curve. Okay, and the last one, there's an arc. Ta-da! That's it. Thank you for coming. No, I have an eraser. So when you talk about a swirl, it's really a C. So we'll talk about some things like that. So from those basic shapes, realistically, you might see complicated quilting, but if you can break it into those 5 different shapes, you can do anything. And a swirl is really just a hook. There's a swirl, right? And you can decide that you're going to go like this with those swirls. And they're not really ever going to cross over. Or you can combine them with something. So of course I have to put a little arc in there. There's another swirl. And you can see I'm using an arc to move around there. And pretty soon I've got a nice filled design. Okay? Very, very easy. Just with those simple, simple shapes. Yes, you can. I can't, but you can. I can only move the machine. I cannot move the fabric.
That's the hard part, translating.
I can't go back and forth from one to the other. So this morning I took a poll of how many were using a long arm machine and how many were using the short arm machine, and my best advice for the short armers was to sign up for the long arm class. Okay? But from those basic shapes, you can make almost anything. So overall, let me keep going with what I was going to talk about. So background fillers are a choice that you usually make. Okay? And from those basic shapes, when I look at a quilt, let's talk about that dreaded sampler quilt. It's not that it's a bad quilt, it's just that I have to really think about it. What am I going to do in it? And the easiest thing for a lot of long arm quilters is the feather, because it, you know, it fits, it fills, it can go anywhere. But really sometimes you have to say a feather quilt is not work on this quilt. It's got lots of geometric shapes. I'm going to put a swirl to contrast against the geometric shapes. And back to how do you make those choices, right? So something with a lot of hard edges might need a little softening up with the swirl or something like that. But if you choose maybe a couple things that you can combine, you're going to have a few things. So let's say I'm going to just do loops and swirls. And I've got a bunch of blocks, and I'll just start with something simple like a 9-patch. Do you like how I sew? This is probably one Della made for me. Okay. Now, first of all, how do you figure out what to quilt on your quilt? I can't quilt without my tracing paper. Okay. If you don't have, I tell people, if you're a beginning quilter and you want to think about the quilting versus the piecing, number one, go get yourself a sketchbook. You need to start making some muscle memories and some visual memories of what you're going to do. So I know you watch me up there and she's like, she just does that. Well, I've done it a lot. The trick is, somebody said, well, you have a background in graphic design. I said, no, I worked for Hewlett-Packard for 5 years. All those meetings, all those phone calls. Right? But a sketchbook, start looking at things. You'll start seeing things. Most of you know I spend a lot of time at the hockey rink. I'll be at the hockey rink going, people look at my husband and say, what is she doing? He's like, she's quilting. In the shower. Working it out, right? So I have sketchbooks of things. These guys will tell you, if you go upstairs on my desk, there's little Post-it notes that have, oh, that's so cute. I'm working it out. I'm copying things that I'm trying to build the visual memory, and I'm trying to have a recipe book of things that I can pull on. Because hand-eye coordination, I can do it. Brain, pretty locked in just about 4 different things I can make for dinner, right? That's all I got. So sketchbooks are great for a repertoire. Next becomes the tissue paper. Why do you want the tissue paper? Because if you have some tissue paper, and I go through a lot of it, it's a little pricey, but I'll go over and buy, 8 or 10 pads at a time. Can't pull it out all by myself. There. I'm going to drop it. Okay, so here's my tissue paper. Here's my block. I like to put one piece of tissue paper over my block and trace the block, then go home. I probably pinned up the quilt already. Then I go home. One of the first things you have to do is decide what is your block. So let's look at the brightly colored 1, 2, 3, 4, 4th quilt up high, the pinks, the oranges. Okay, what's the block? Is it the 4-patch inside the white box? Are you going to quilt a motif that's just in the 4-patch? Or are you going to quilt a bigger motif that includes the white box? Or are you going to expand it up even more and quilt one great big feathered wreath, for example, that includes the white box and the piece triangles around it? Does everybody see what I mean? So when you put your quilt on the wall to look at it, lots of times I'll ask Tracy if I'm working on a quilt, I'll say, could you just take a photograph of it before I do it so I can look at it later? Because when it's on the table, I can only see a little bit. So she'll take a picture of it, and that helps me. In this case, you might look at it.
Stacy?
What?
Did you mean Stacy?
Did I say Tracy?
Yeah.
That's one of the AC girls, whatever. She's going to be my daughter-in-law. Everyone say we're so sorry for her later. We're sorry. It's great. Anyway. Poor thing, right? She gets me. I'm getting the better side of the deal. Anyway, if you can decide what your block is and what you're going to do in it or how you're going to split it up, for example, on that quilt, I might decide, I really want those white squares to recede into the background, and I want to pop up the little 4-patch in the middle. I could do a little tight, tiny background fill on those white squares and push them down into the background. It would make whatever was in those little 4-patch boxes just pop, right? But like I said, you need to have a couple different repertoire items in your head. And it's better if you kind of know what you're going to do. Trust me, from spending my whole first year of thinking I'll just do it and then ripping it out, it's a lot better if you mess up on paper first. So if you put your block on your main tissue paper, then you can go through pages and pages of saying, well, I need loopies here, so let's see, what if I just did big loopy, 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 whoops, sorry, no tape. Loopy, 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 loopy. Do I like that? I don't know. And then sometimes another trick is if it's really bad, you can go over it again, and suddenly that makes ribbony loopies. Good thing I can do this on the machine, and you can go from there. But the nice part about the tissue paper is you say, oh, that's not what I had in mind. And you can move over here, another piece of paper. Yeah. Okay, and you can say, you know, I'm going to do something totally different. I'm going to try my swirl in this block, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do a swirl, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do a swirl, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to, you see, and you can mess up on the paper or do whatever you're going to do, right? Much better to do it on paper over and over. So that's just a simpler way to help yourself along of what you're going to do. Then you have to look at, well, what can I do? Obviously, I can't do those swirls very good, so I'll try something else. So I could stitch in the ditch on this block. One of the things I could do is just stitch in the ditch, and I could do a real tight fill in some of the every other blocks, and that would make me a nice checkerboard. And I could come over here in the block next to it, which just happens to be blank, and I could repeat the same motif in thread without the block pattern. Or I don't really want to stitch in the ditch because I'm not very good at it. So there's a lady who's got a really, really old machine, and it's so old I went to fix it once. In her left-hand handle, all she has is a screwdriver. No switch, just the screwdriver. And you know what? She's quilting up a storm over there with what she does best. And she just starts up here and she wiggles down, and she wiggles over, and she wiggles back up, and she wiggles over, and she wiggles around, and she doesn't. And she uses the block outline to do something that looks pretty cute. And if you really didn't like it, again, go around again. Pretty soon you got a little ribbony thing going on. So what to quilt on your quilt comes back to, in some ways, what can you do, and a little bit of your imagination. And you put some of those shapes together, and you'll find that you can actually make quite a few things. Some things you can actually simplify. So I'll show you some tricks, because everybody wants to know how to make a feather. Or am I wrong? Nobody cares? Want to know how to make a feather? Sure. Okay, there's lots of ways. Number one way I was taught, you come up the feather, there's an S curve. Okay? The top of the S, you make another S curve, half a heart. And you just follow the line down. And for those of you that struggle with this, follow the line, follow the stem, don't touch it. Go alongside of it, real close. Don't do what, can y'all see that okay? What not to do? Bad. Don't do that. No. Oh, Carol's watching. Carol's my inspector. When I quilt, Carol comes up, oh, yeah. She likes to see what I'm doing. So there's your little feather there, right? Now the other side of it is you've got two choices. And when I first learned, I could only go in one direction. So I had to travel back up and do another row. And see how right here I'm going to curve around a little bit more. And if you don't like the way that looks, you can always decorate it. You can come back in here and fill that little guy up. And if you know you're going to decorate it in the beginning, it helps because you can leave yourself a little more room. Okay, you get the idea? And you're like, well, that's great. That's just one feather. What about another feather, right? Well, one of the things you need to learn how to do and back is just that I call it half an echo. How do you fill something up? How do you quilt to fill? Oh yeah, that sounds so easy, right? Quilt to fill. Well, sometimes you may just have to stop. But let's say the challenge is that I came all the way up here and I'm like, okay. And you say, Karen, you just can't lift your pencil up. So I came up here and I went, well, I'll come over here. And I got another one going over here. And I'm going to cheat a little bit and just do the other side. Little echo. But you can always echo anything around and so on and so forth, but you don't always have to echo the whole thing exactly. Okay, just move yourself around, but this is where it really helps if you just have a little sketchbook or something to do. And you're like, I don't care what you say, I cannot do those feathers, I hate those feathers, and they look really dumb and floppy anyway. So there's other kinds of feathers you can do. And feathers make good borders. Same idea, but a hook. Or, if you want to get real crazy, you can do an heirloom feather, which starts out as a feather. Okay, 1, 2, and then you have to trace over it. And you kind of learn to get a rhythm there of what you're doing. I can't believe I'm talking to you and doing this at the same time. Oh, not too bad. She says, Sometimes you might have a big motif or a quilt where you really want to put in these things. Do these things first, okay? Come over here, do the next thing. You can come back in and just fill it with a little tiny fill later. Okay, you can quilt it evenly all over, or you can put some certain motifs in and leave it be. Sometimes it's like working on a painting. Believe it or not, the best advice I ever got about doing a drawing was that don't ever start down here in the corner doing this, because by the time you get to the other side, you're tired of that. That's really good, by the way, right there. Okay, do the whole thing at once. So put in your big components first. Plan your quilt a little bit. Sometimes you might just draw in using a big, like a, I like to use the Soline pencils. And I know if I'm coming in with a Soline pencil, maybe I know I'm going to have a big feather, or a big flower here. So I'll mark that circle that I know I'm going to go around it with my feather, and I'm going to come back in later with something else. Okay? And as far as where do you find those motifs, or how do you put them in there, or how do you do it, you see things like Laura Lee Fritz, where she's got amazing drawings, and you think, I can't do that at all, I can't. It's actually a lot easier than you think. You only have to figure out what some of those big motifs are. So I'll use Laura Lee Fritz as an example. She's got books and books of, for example, a horse, and she'll have a bear, and she'll have a dog. And you think, well, she just drew those. No, she didn't. And she's putting it in her book after she's erased it a few times and made the continuous line. And how do you do that on your quilt? Well, you can trace it on your quilt before you put it on your machine, but you can also just trace those kind of things onto Glad Press and Seal. Anybody ever use this stuff? Available at your grocery store. You can size anything up or down using your handy dandy little printer. Maybe you've got a printer at home. I have like 16 of them because we worked for HP. And my husband will never throw them away. This is Glad Press and Seal. It's by the Reynolds Wrap and the Saran Wrap. It's sticky. It's got little micro suction cups. And you can trace over it. You want to use something like a Sharpie that's permanent ink, because you don't want anything that'll bleed if it gets wet or flake if it's like this dry erase. You draw right on it. It will stick. How's that on your microphone? Bad. Okay, over here. It will stick. You can sew right through it on your sewing machine, and then you're going to pull it. You have to pop it off. The stitches will pop through it. So, yes.
Where do you put it on to draw your design, or does it?
I put it right on the book. See? Let's say, oh, I was going to show you this book. I have 2 new books that we're taking pre-orders for. If you aren't aware, all of our books are now 20% off all the time because I got tired of competing with Amazon. So there you go. Okay, so it's sticky on one side, right? I can put it right on what I want to do and trace with my Sharpie. I'm going to put this right on the fabric. See, it sticks. You can pin it in a couple places, but it will stick. Sew right over it. Pull it off. Throw it. It's if you sew a lot of things. So if you have a habit of going in one little place, it will be hard to get it out. But if you have a little, like a 1/4 of an inch gap between everything, it won't be bad. If you said, oh, I'm going to copy one of her feathers, you know, you might, if you had a habit and you got a big mess in some of these where you were all over this stem, you might have a harder time getting it out. If that's the case, they make products like called Solvy, which you can draw on them. Again, you want to use a permanent marker like a Sharpie or a Prisma pen, and when it gets wet, it dissolves. So once you wash it, it'll come right out. Okay? So it kind of comes down to making all those decisions for your quilts. I think if you pick a couple motifs and you've got blocks, you can use the blocks to do simple things. I think a lot of those things are easy. But how do you know what to do in those blocks? I'm going to go back to those 5 basic shapes. Play around with it. Draw the block. Make yourself do 4 different options for that block. It's like playing Scrabble. Anybody playing Words with Friends? I'm beating Della. Okay, my son in the back, not so much, but he's beating me, but I think he's cheating. Anyway, if you're playing Scrabble or something like that, don't you rearrange your letters? And then you're like, okay, I think I can spell the word top. Let's see if I got anything else with these letters, right? With my 7 letters. Take a couple shapes. I'm going to give yourself, start with something simple like a 9 patch or a churn dash block and say, I'm going to come up with an idea for this block that just uses loops. And you've seen some things. Look at your quilting magazines and pick some things. And look at the background fills. Now this is my new book, and yes, I'm selling it to you. This is, the checker rep was here this week, and I said, I have to have that book. This is her 1 copy that she sells from. But I can pre-order it for you. So I said, give me that book. I'll take names on Saturday. You don't have to pay for it till it comes in. But I get a copy. I like it. Now this is back to, I can do everything in this book. Wait, I'll get it so you can see it. I can do everything in this book. But I can't always think of it. So if you have a notebook full of little ideas and designs, good for you. But I think the book's kind of handy just to say, oh, look at all those different fills. I like this one. I saw this in a border around something, right? A little, like the white border around that 4 patch. Just turn the corner, down, just cute. There's a website online, I think the gal has 365 different quilting designs that you can go and look at. But this for me was just one idea. And she gets a little, yeah. See? That's where a fill comes in handy. Do some lines, do some fills. I've got a sunbonnet Sue on my table today. I don't know why. It's just like, okay, it's really not my colors, and it's a sunbonnet Sue. How many of you think that's just right up my alley? I struggle with some of those things, and I'm going to start on it tomorrow. I've been thinking about it for a week. Sometimes I just do. I can't help it. But, you know, I have a couple of choices. What can you do around an applique? I save things about, okay, can I sew on top of the applique? Do I need to? Do I need to put any little bows on her apron? Or do I just, you know, outline her and then do a background fill? Am I going to put something in the background? Very, very popular things are just outlining, right? Or echoing around and around. There's another style of echoing that I like a lot better called McTavishing. You guys familiar with that at all? I'll give you a little example of that. So I don't like echoing as much because it bothers me when it's not perfect. I know. But here's your applique shape. You can also see why I don't applique a lot.
Is echo quilting the same as the Hawaiian contour quilting?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't know. I live in Arizona. That's not that warm. Okay, so echo quilting probably, where you're just going to go around it, and you go around it, and you go around it. And it gets really boring pretty darn fast in a big block, in my opinion. I'm just like around and they don't like to listen to me whine about that either, because believe me, I'm whining about it. And every time I do it, because I just get to the point where I'm like, I don't know what else to do, and I do it, and then I rip it out every damn time. I've been quilting for like 10 years. I'm still ripping it out. So here's my applique. I'm going to give you a different way to fill this block. It's called McTavishing, and it's really sort of the same thing. And you might start out as an echo, right? But then you kind of veer off and you do something else, and you just kind of count, and you just curve around. And she usually counts to 4, and then she goes a different direction. Now she backtracks more, but there's really not a lot of rules about this, so she might backtrack, but she'll come down to here and then kind of do this. Then you can do that and do that. Do that, and just basically fill in the space. And that's much better for me. Okay, and you can kind of, if you've ditched it, you can kind of come around there. So this is named after a lady named Karen McTavish, who, I don't know, she just started doing it, and she does little tiny things, and everybody just started doing it, and so everybody called it McTavishing, and there you go. And you can kind of go from there. And if you want to, it's kind of back to the thing, if you wanted to set a big motif before you got in there, let's say this was the applique, but you wanted it to have another little flower up here, maybe you quilt that in, and then you just include that in whatever you're doing down here, right? And pretty soon you've just got another little something in there. Blah, 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 blah. Okay?
Only on the long arm.
I can't do it anywhere else. I could pass around some things I've quilted now. So we have some samples of things to talk about, because I wanted to talk about choosing thread color, choosing fabrics. I don't know where my pen cap is. So one of the things that my employees have said to me since working here is that they have a whole different perspective on choosing fabrics and quilts and backs and thread color, because they see so many things come in. So many of us make a top, choose the back with no thought whatsoever of how it's going to be quilted or what thread color we're going to use. And that makes a big difference. So when you're piecing your top, you may have just loved it when you saw it in the quilt shop. They tell me, be careful what I quilt on a sample, because I have to do it another 12 times, you know. And that's right. But you may have loved it in the quilt shop because of how it was quilted. Be aware of that. And be sure that you can do that. And that's another reason we don't custom quilt all our samples, because we don't want to do something that you can't necessarily make, or you know, have to make it to get that effect, right? But as you're picking your tops and you're picking your backs, you want to think about the thread color. If you're a really good quilter and you want that quilting to show, pick a contrasting thread. on that Sunbonnet Sue, don't you think they'd be just irritated as hell if I used black thread in the background? Right? Because they want to see my quilting, I betcha. But what we see a lot is that the top is just gorgeous, and obviously, like the Sunbonnet Sue needs to be quilted with white thread in most of it. But let's say the back is a solid royal blue. My personal preference is that light thread looks okay on dark. Dark thread on light looks terrible. It just grates on my nerves. But on the back, you are going to see every little niggle and bubble. On the front, a lot of those stops and starts are hidden in the edge of an applique or in a seam. But on the back, you're going to see it all. So my favorite quilts, I always show them this. I brought these to show you. This was quilted. This is my first quilt I ever made. I cut out, this is one, if you've heard me talk about cutting, I cut it out on my plush carpeting on the floor.
She did have a rotary cutter and mat.
I did have a rotary cutter and a mat, because I'll be dang, I knew what I was doing. So some of the stripes are different sizes. They're all supposed to be the same, and I quilted it with monofilament thread. And I used my small machine and I quilted it in little double rows diagonally. And the best way to make evenly spaced lines is with masking tape, because you just have to sew one and then you just move your tape over. But as bad as I was at piecing for my first one and not knowing anything about quilting, it looks pretty darn good. You can't even see the quilting, which again is just fabulous. Take my word for it. And even the piecing's a little iffy. It quilted out, thank God, most of it. And I don't think there were any holes in it. And I use this quilt all the time, which goes back to my point. You do what you can do. Okay? We'll just drop them down. Another quilt that I quilted, let's do the going dotty one. And this was the pillow I made with the pieces that would not fit. And they had to be redone. So I'm just like, well, I'll just make a pillow. This is one of the first quilts I ever quilted on the long arm machine. And back to you do what you can do. I did the whole thing in 3.5 hours. Which end are you taking? Nan Kelly let me use her machine after many weeks of practicing on charity quilts. And again, it's pretty busy. You can't really see what I did. It is the craziest. I call it drunken sailor quilting. And the good news is these are spirals if you'd like to look at really, really wild and uneven spirals. And I think it's better than anything I could do today, because now I can make a perfect spiral, and I would try. And I would make perfect things, and it just wouldn't be as interesting because it's pretty woohoo, right? And I would like to point out the fabulous back, because I was using white thread, and you can't see it. It's wonderful because you can't see it. So sometimes a busy back with a small pattern, because a busy back with a small pattern is going to hide your quilting. And you have to make some decisions. So let me show you something. How about the one with the funky border on it?
Which one?
No, it's one of Kat's. It's not that. You can hand me that one next. The one where it's got black, red, this one right here. Red and black on the edge, yeah. So this is an interesting one to show you. This is Kat's. She brought it in. Somebody else quilted it a while ago. I mean, it's not bad. Well, like we won't pick it apart, but it's not bad. But what I would show you is what is really kind of different about it is the back. Because she switched thread colors. So she's got white in the main part of it, but if you look on the back, she used a red thread in the border, and then I told Kat this morning, I said it before, it was out of my mouth before I realized I was saying, oh, looky there. She's got this little tiny black stipple outlining the feather on the edge. And the stipple's a little bit big, so it really doesn't do its job, which should be if you want it to pop and you're just in a small area, you're going to have to do a little denser. And you really see that red and black on the back of your quilt. You get to decide if you want that or not. Had she chosen a busier back, you know, something with a little bit of everything in it, because there's white thread on it, maybe a little black, red, white, smaller. You'd never see it. But you guys get to decide. You know, I have my customers that come in, and I look at them, I'm like, oh, the back. And they're like, yes, I want to see everything. I'm like, that's a lot of pressure. Okay, why not? This is another reason of why you probably shouldn't custom quilt something. This is my own quilt, so I can custom quilt it if I want to, because I don't have to pay anybody to do it. And but you really can't see too much of the quilting. I chose yellow, bright yellow thread. It kind of blends everywhere. If you really want to see any of these, you can come up afterwards and look. And on the back, I'm really good. I like to show you how good I am all the time. See, this is my kind of back because you can't pick me apart. Much better. Okay, let's show the multicolored ones. This one I think is the stunning one. Okay, thread color. The trend today is, I will also say, Uber quilting. Lots and lots and lots of quilting, right? So people ask me what color thread or what kind of thread I like. I really do like the So Fine thread that we stock now, and that's all I've been using because it's finer and it lays a little flatter. And if your thread color is going to match the background of your quilt, you're not going to see that big hunks of thread because you maybe went over things a while. So this is pretty densely quilted in some places, but the gal quilted it and Kat wasn't happy with it, and she talked to her and she said, oh, I wanted more quilting. And I think this is a great example. I'll just show you the back. Kat said, can you do some more? So let's turn it for the front. She went back in with a different color thread and did, you know, sort of the twice quilted thing and put in some accents which really make the quilt. Now, what do you quilt on your quilt? If you have someone else quilting your quilt, you really have to have a good relationship with them, because I would never do this for someone unless they said, I really want you to do that. Because this is really an artistic statement. And in my opinion, just one of the reasons why you should quilt your own quilts, because, you know, that's not a lot. Let's look at this. That's not really even a lot of technical skill. She did a shape, and she went over it multiple times. Little thread painting. If you're not real steady, go around again, okay? If you're drawing something, I find lots of times that if you're drawing a main motif like this flower or the leaves, and here with the little swirl, she's kind of come off with a tendril and then gone back over it, a little ribbony look. If you're not perfect, just backtrack over the other way. Or if you're trying to draw a motif on it, some of your main motifs, I'll try to draw like, you know, the flowers and then come up with a connector, and maybe my connector is just the little loopy or the little leaf. But I've gone around the flower maybe 2 or 3 times to make that pop out just a little bit more. I could go on, but I don't want to keep you all day. So do you have any questions or anything that you would like me to address specifically?
When you're talking about feathers, it seems like it would be easy to go, you know, like you do, have it. What about if you're doing a border across the top and you're, you know, it's going to be, you know what I mean, as opposed to going up and down, drawing half a heart, if you're going across, how do you get that same motion?
How do you do it? Is the same motion, and you have to practice in your sketchbook, and you know, that's the bad news. You need to work at HP, because they will, you know, bore the snot out of you so bad that thank you. Thank you. So part of the thing of in your sketchbook is learning how to draw something to fill the space. And somebody this morning asked, well, how do you not get yourself in a corner? It's really the same idea of you have to learn how to go upside down, across, right, the other way. What I was going to say, when I learned to do a feather, I was taught to go this way. And I saw a picture of a quilt of mine once, and all I could see was this. And I thought, ew. So I didn't want to go up that line again, so I made myself learn how to go the other way. And the good news is that feathers are never symmetrical. So a little bit like you might draw a little bit one way and a little bit the other way, but it doesn't matter. But you're just going to have to do a little practice that you can go left and right and up and down. The other side of it on a border, and there's tons of border patterns that you can, people say, how do you put in a border? Tons of border patterns. Maybe some you don't get past the free motion. You stay with the patterns and the pantographs. The only problem is that you have to do the top border and the corners, do the middle, the bottom and the corners. Then you have to take it off and turn it and make it fit and do it. And I did a lot of that. But let's go back to what I said at the very beginning. How much time or how much money, and why is your long arm quilter so expensive? When people take my long arm quilting class, I always tell them you're either going to really, really love it or you're going to give me a much nicer Christmas gift than you were thinking. Because you're going to appreciate more what some of your favorite quilters might be doing in terms of they just don't go out and quilt your quilt. Lots of them look at it, think about it, plan it, come up with the design, all that practice. Did I have another question? Yes, absolutely. Is there a cost difference between pantograph quilting and custom quilting? There sure is, both if you're doing it or if somebody else is doing it. Most of our long arm quilters that rent our machines can do an overall king or queen size quilt in one day pretty easy, right? Don't you think? 3 weeks later, I'll be honest with you, custom quilting is not lucrative for me. I enjoy doing it. I take my time. If I've quilted something for you, you can say, I know I had to wait forever for her to get it done. But the cost, and the cost-wise is about, it's at least double. In there's a lot of, here's a good way to put it, there's a lot of variety out there. There's some custom long arm quilters that are very, very good. And, it's like your hairdresser, I guess, that, don't I look nice? But this cost me. Somebody said, why don't you get a new phone? Your phone shuts itself off all the time. Buy yourself a new damn phone. I said, I can't afford it. I got my hair done. But those are some of the choices. And find a quilter you like. Ask to see their work. Ask them to give a bid on your project. If you think you're going to have somebody else do it, is the best thing I would say. To see some things they've done. I wouldn't even, trust me, I've got nothing to show. Oh, I got one thing. That black thing. Where is it? One more thing I'll show them. Want to get the black one out? I can't hardly show you anything I wouldn't, and I'm too slow. I got this one in cats, maybe that one, the other one. So here's another example of custom quilting that hardly shows, but I think it's worth it. Now this quilt we had as a kit, and Carol and Della, sorry, can you hear me back there? Carol and Della hand appliqued this needle turn. Isn't that stunning? And I did custom quilt the sample. Now somebody asked me if I would sell it, and I said, because we sell a lot of our samples, and I said, no, I don't think I could sell it. I'd have to sell it for at least $1,000. And they said, I'll pay. This morning somebody said, I'll pay $100 or $1,100, whatever, $1,100. I said, no, it's not for sale. But it's worth that, but it's not worth it to somebody who doesn't appreciate it. I don't really want the Mona Lisa. I think it's ugly. But it's worth a lot of money, right? So you have to decide what kind of things you like. And I guess last, thank you, Della. She's so good, Vanna. This is a pattern that we have for sale in the shop that Kat designed, and I've quilted it a couple of times. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful quilt, and it allows for some very show-offy types of quilting. But when you're making it, you kind of know you're going to have some nice quilting in it. And you could have just done, and let's say you could have just done an overall background fill and all of it, it'd still be a nice quilt, but not near as stunning. So I think this is a good example of quilting makes the quilt. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one on that. In the corner, up toward where the body
you did the boss. The one, you did the feathers and you just came to the end rather than going around the corner.
Yeah.
So, how difficult is it to go around the corner and keep the feather going? Do you find that a lot more difficult?
No.
No.
No. I use a lot of plastic circle templates, and I'll mark a circle. When I'm doing, there, I just helped you there. I just dropped it. I just dropped it like a hot potato. This will be a small version of a big border, okay? I got a big border. We'll pretend that's 100 inches, okay? So I know how big the quilt is when I'm looking at it, and I kind of will mark it off and say, well, I'm going to have a circle in this corner, and I usually have an uneven number. So let's just say I'll put one here, and one here, one here, and one in the corner, and I'll mark those off at equal intervals, just with a marking tool, okay? And then I'm going to use a curve to draw the spine, and what happens is I just draw a little bit and I'll draw the curve, so this one's going to come around this way, and then the next one, sorry, I got to go around, it's going to come around that way, okay? And I'll mark those. Again, so now as you see is that in the line. Now I'm ready to quilt it, and it's really pretty easy because you're going to come around with your feather. This is a little bigger than I probably do it, but you get the idea. And you come around this corner, you go like this, and you just wrap yourself back around. And you say, well, what are you going to do in those little areas? Well, little circly thingy maybe. Okay, you get the idea? And also you can decide beforehand what you're going to do. You're either going to fill to the edge, you know, so you're either going to come in here when you're doing it and do something that kind of goes around like that, or, you know, does something. Or later you're going to come back in and do some kind of fill in behind it. Those are choices. On a custom quilt job, you want to spend a little time with the quilt before you just start sewing. Because trust me, you'll be really mad. I have picked out some, I'm really fast at picking it out, but why would that be? Practice, right? Well, that's not the thing you want to practice. I changed my mind after the first block or two. Oh, am I peeved? Because I know I'm going to pick it out. My husband, the first year I was a long arm quilter, you know how husbands say, don't ask me if that makes you look fat? Well, my husband used to say, don't ask me if you should pick it out because you know you're gonna. So having a plan ahead of time is going to save you hours and hours. I have it down. 15 minutes to quilt it is 3 hours. Picking it out. Oh, I'm fast. Okay, any other questions? I'm probably way over time. I appreciate it. Della's passing out a coupon. You could have just asked for that right up front. We would have been done.